Hi, I hope everybody's doing well. Got a little bit of a Tim's Tips session here for you. I had a great question from Jay, and he said, I've got another question and video idea for you. It says, why does my saw cut crooked in a log, and is the bar slot worn and too wide? Or how to fix this? Is my chain dull on one side? Are my depth gauges or rakers not filed correctly? Thanks for the help. Well, actually, Jay, it's a great group of questions, and more or less they're part of the problem. So it's something to where we have to kind of think through it and take a look to see what all the issues could be and how we can be able to try to correct them in some cases. Well, Jay, the first question, why does my saw cut crooked in a log? That could be all three items you talked about. The bar slot being worn or too wide. It could be also your chain is dull on one side. And your depth gauges could actually cause it to pull left or right too, according to their settings. What I think we need to talk about here just a little bit is, which way it's pulling. Is it pulling to the left or to the right? Which side is dull or sharp? Or if there's problems with your depth gauges. That would be the first thing to look at. We start to examine the bar rails to see if they're true, and that would mean that they would be flat, one side not worn or shorter than the other. You have to look for a flaring, or what I call a peening, that happens on the bar rails. Any kind of a flattening there along the top edges, we need to clear that off. And then also, it could be the depth gauges and points are a little bit off. In other words, your depth gauge more aggressive on one side or the other. Also, it could be point damage that would cause it to pull to one side or the other. So let's say that your saw is pulling to the left. The first thing that I would check would be the right side cutters and right side rails, because it's going to pull to the sharper side. So if it's pulling to the left, your right side is most likely dulled. If it's pulling to the right, your left side is most likely dulled. And so if everything is true, you should be able to guide that through the kerf as it's cutting. And that meaning staying straight with just light pressure. One thing that can cause the curved cuts is applying too much pressure on the handles. You have to make sure you think about, you don't want to apply pressure on the handles left or right, because the saw is going to turn that way. So you more or less, you can use the dogs to be able to balance that cut. In other words, keep it straight. But you don't want to apply leverage there. That's not the purpose of them. If you apply leverage or leverage to the handles, it's going to start pulling one side or the other in some cases, or it's going to create those issues of rolled over points or damaged points. It's going to cause the left side or the right side of the rail to become uneven. So all those things start to add up. So I thought we'd take a look at proper setting on the depth gauge, and then also making sure no point damage there. So we'll try to point that out. So some tools to work with. One of them is the bar dresser, and this is a tool that you can utilize a flat file for it. The real I guess advantage of the bar dresser is you have a 90-degree file holder and a very aggressive file that can take the metal off and be able to true things up for you. So this is a neat tool created by Ferd. Oregon also has a bar dressing tool that can be used. And then the standard flat file and handle. Another tool that's available. And this one is a non-commercial unit. This one a gentleman made for me many years ago in a shop, and this is a bar rail closer. And so as the bar rails flare, or you have a widening of the bar rail, you can be able to use this. The bar fits in the slot here. You can adjust these rollers together, and it presses the bar rails. And so that can keep things tight against your chain gauge. And so this is a very valuable tool. Good handle on this one. I've seen some commercial units available also, but I've had this one for years back in the shop. Carried it with me for quite a while, dressing bars in the field. And so that's something to think through there. And then the other gauges to check with, I have the Husqvarna EM gauge, and this is a progressive gauge that basically takes and measures each tooth independently, and then the standard Oregon Gauge It, which is a 25 thousandths tool to be able to check for the depth gauge setting on the saw. Take a look here at the way the Gauge It fits on. Now this takes and averages out 2 or 3 teeth, and you would file off whatever sticks up through it so you can be able to check it. If you could think about checking these, you would use a flat edge across and then take and use a feeler gauge. Well, that's basically what this tool does. It works like a 25 thousandths feeler gauge setup. You would file off anything up here that sticks through. And then this gauge takes each tooth independently. There's a hardwood and a softwood setting. And it is a little bit more aggressive, but more or less it sets up, and I like it because it kind of angles the depth gauge a little bit easier to keep that radius on the front of it. And so that's a key there to think through also. And so that would be 2 tools that we could check to make sure that everything is going to run good on our chains, and definitely looking at the points themselves. If you see any damage on the points on the left side, as I said, it's going to pull to the right. If you have damage on the right side points, it's going to pull to the left as you cut. So you look for those damages as you start to think through the process here. One other thing on depth gauge settings that I think is very important, and that's thinking through out of the box. Most of the time your stock depth gauge setting is going to be about 25 thousandths of an inch. So that means your depth gauge is 25 thousandths of an inch lower than the point or working corner on the tooth, and then a 35. But going much over 35 thousandths gets pretty aggressive. And so using it for bore cuts and cutting brush and those kinds of things can be a little bit tricky with more than 35 thousandths on the depth gauge setting. So think about that. I find in most cases 25 to 30 thousandths, maybe 31, 32 is about the most aggressive that I like to go. I've heard some things of people running 50 thousandths, and that's really too aggressive. I had one gentleman in a class up in the Chicago area, and he ran his chain a little bit aggressive, on the aggressive side. But I find that you know, even he had trouble with it in bucking. If it got into a little bit harder wood, it would start to really pull the saw down. If you applied any pressure, start to kind of pull the chain RPM down. So you don't want that to happen. You want it to be able to feed. And so I find if you set it about that 25 to 30 thousandths, you can then be able to take and more or less pull back on the chain. And that's one other thing that can cause a little bit of issue when it comes to a chain cutting properly. If it's too tight to the bar, that chain can't come out and move as necessary, which is up and down and side to side to actually clear the chip. When a chain is cutting correctly, it pulls good ways out of the bar rail. When you start to think through, if I push against the rails, that chain really can't work as well as it's supposed to, setting up use of your angles and the depth gauge setting. Too loose, and you end up with it kind of buckling up under any pressure as you get into different soft and hard wood types. So all of those things are important to understand as we're thinking through making sure our depth gauges and our cutting conditions are the best that it can possibly be. Okay, checking out the bar, we want to make sure, first of all, our oil holes and everything are clear. and so nothing plugging those. And check our bar rail to make sure everything is clean. Use some type of a tool that will go down into the rail and keep that debris cleaned out. Next thing is looking for any kind of a rim, or I call it a peening, that takes place here. You can be able to use a flat file to take it off, or you can utilize a bar dresser like this. And this makes it really nice because you can be able to hold this, and it takes off anything on that side. Very, very sharp, aggressive file. This is a 90-degree file holder then. So you can be able to quickly take that, that material off. That keeps everything running true. And so that's the first thing to check. The other thing would be the actual flatness of the bar rails themselves. And sometimes you'll find bars that have a little bit thicker on one side than the other, and sometimes that happens, and you'll find that one side kind of wears a little faster than the other. But any flaring or flashing that's there will cause that to speed up the process. The other thing is your then drive links should go down and be fairly snug into the rail. You want to make sure that you don't have a lot of excessive movement in the rail with the drive links. If you do, you can be able to use this rail tool, and this sets up, and you can see the rollers. And what happens is you pull it through, you tighten the lever down, and that basically rolls those rails together. And so you can close that rail down on the bar. It doesn't work as well on laminate bars where you have two thin pieces with a sandwich piece in the middle, but on the full professional solid bars, it's very nice to have, because you're going to get, after you run a few chains through, you're going to get the drive links kind of wallowing left and right, and it creates kind of a fishtail down in the bottom of the rail. That starts to happen because the upper rail starts to separate, and so you can utilize this rail roller to be able to close those back down to the proper settings. You know, most standard bars, if you get into some of the climbing saws and into pole saws, you'll find sometimes 43 thousandths of an inch, but most of your bars on the saws are 50 thousandths, 58 or 63 thousandths. And that's the thickness of this gap that'll fit tightly against the chain drive link, and that's what you want to have. So very important to think through that. So again, the bar rail roller will close down the rails, making sure the rails are clean, and then also making sure that your bar rails themselves are true. And this works out really good. A 90-degree holder here for it. And so that you go right up against the rails, and you can be able to make sure that your rails are completely 90 degrees. They're both true. And this file, very aggressive, does a really good job of keeping those things correct. About a once a week maintenance. It's according to how much you cut, but if you're cutting every day, at least once a week, I find you want to dress this, clean it, make sure the rails are clean, your oil holes are open, and your sprocket tips. Now I myself, I don't use any type of bar grease on the sprocket up here. I just simply keep everything as clean as possible and let the bar oil take care of it. There are some pinpoint grease guns, and you can use some bearing lube to be able to do that. But I tell you, I've put many hours on these things and tested a lot of bars that way. If you look at most of your steel bars, you'll find that there's not a grease hole in those, and that's simply because it's not really necessary. So that's something to consider there. But you can see on this bar, I've got some debris starting to clog up the holes here. And so you want to make sure that those are open. After that, making sure the entire rail is cleared. And you can see here. Now I'm getting some flaring, or peening I call it, on the outer edge here, and that can cause your chain to start to ride funny. And so you want to make sure that you keep all of that cleared off. And that's what this tool can do. So you can be able to check it here at 90 degrees, and then also be able to take and take those flarings down on the side. And one thing I have a lot of questions about, you'll see the steel bars with the paint starting to come off of the edges. People say, oh, my bar's been so hot. And that's actually the heat treating process that steel uses, which is a heated coil. They run the bars through it, takes it up to thousands of degrees, and that's how they heat treat and harden the rails. So when you lose your paint off the edge of the bar and you see that black and blue around the edges, that's just the heat treat process. That's not a real damaged bar per se. So you will make sure all of that is in good shape. And so that's kind of it. So Jay, I hope that answers your questions. We've got several issues there, but yes, your bar rails being untrue can eventually cause it. Peening around the edge, your depth gauge setting, but the number one thing that I find if my chain starts cutting to one side or the other is going to be damage on the points. That's the first place to look. Little information there. I hope you've picked up something you'll be able to use. We appreciate the questions coming in. Please send them in, comments on the YouTube channels, as well as on Instagram, and also you can send it in to info@forestapps.com. We'll be glad to try to put together an information video and a podcast series also, so all of that's available for passing along information the best we can, useful tips with chainsaws. And this is Tim Ard wishing you good sawing.